Thank you for joining us. So today we're going to talk about racism and its relationship to law. And let me tell you how I came across, how I thought about this topic. So as you might know, I've been teaching a course in the Ayn Rand University called The Road to Critical Race Theory. I'm teaching it with Onkar Gate. And particularly on the topic of critical race theory itself, and on the topic of intersectionality, the leading intellectuals, the leading scholars behind this movement were from the field of law. And their actual starting point was that, A, to examine the relations between racism and law historically, and also to figure out what are the effects of this racist history as it appears in law today. Because, for example, if there's still an effect today, even the law has changed from, let's say, Jim Crow or from redlining laws, then maybe they claim we should take steps such as affirmative action or positive discrimination. We're going to see all that. Today we have our in-house legal experts. We have James Valliant. So you might know James as an author, as an intellectual on the history of ideas, but actually what you might not know, or perhaps you do, is that he was also a legal professional and a prosecutor. So he is the person the go-to person to understand law. So hi, James.
Hi, Nikos.
And thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
Let's start with the basics. So let's go back to let's say to the pre-Civil War era. So of course on the South we have slavery. In the rest of the United States, what is the situation regarding the law and Black people? Actually include slavery. Was there anything in the South, any legal provision with slaves? For example, I don't know, you couldn't treat them very inhumanely or something. Or were they not even a subject of the law?
Well, they were certainly a subject of law even in the South, but basically property law. Their rights as humans were not recognized. And there actually were places in which the treatment of slaves was to some degree regulated by law, but in effect, they weren't regarded as persons. And unfortunately, the original, the founding fathers did want to eliminate slavery. Many of them, at least, most of them, I would say, wanted to eliminate slavery at the time of the founding. They wanted Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams all wanted it into the Declaration of Independence. It was the strenuous objections of South Carolina, which basically influenced North Carolina, that said, no, you're not going to get us to join your revolution if you include this anti-slavery provision. And so for purely pragmatic reasons, even though it contradicted, the equal protection idea and the Declaration of Independence, so the philosophy of the Declaration flatly contradicted slavery as such. Indeed, racial inequality before the law as such, but the slavery provision in the Declaration was taken out, and compromises in the Constitution to permit Southern slavery to continue went on. But some of the first governments in the world to eliminate slavery were the northern states in the wake of the Revolution. By the early 1800s, nearly all of the northern states had made slavery illegal in their states. Remember, the Federal Bill of Rights only protected us against the federal government's violation of rights. The states were largely left to do their own thing, and that meant have established religions, that meant have slavery. The Bill of Rights of the federal Constitution did not get enforced against the states, even in theory, until the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. And that was the critical moment. When the Civil War happened, the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution were passed, abolishing slavery across the board in every state, and requiring the states to not violate the privileges and immunities of the citizens, all persons in their states, and equal protection of the laws for all persons in their states. So it was meant to protect freed Black slaves in the South, but it was much broader. It included all persons and all inequality under the law. Well, the Privileges and Immunities Clause was gutted immediately by the Supreme Court. I mean, right out of the chute. Right out of the chute in the 1870s and 80s. They said, that's not what that means. And so Southern states, by federal courts ignoring the 14th Amendment, were allowed to do Jim Crow, racially discriminatory laws.
So let's pause here for a second. So tell us a bit about Jim Crow. So it was legal then, despite the 14th Amendment. And also tell us a bit why when it appears, and tell us a bit what it meant for an average Black person in the South.
Oh, it was devastating for ordinary Black people in many places, not just the South, but many places had racially discriminated. In California, we had anti-Chinese discrimination laws, for example. There was forms of private, even private racism that were going on in the North because they were trying to appease the South. But the laws in the South were the basic generators of anti-Black legislation, and it was devastating. In the wake of the Civil War, the whites who had previously been in charge reasserted themselves as the states were readmitted into the Union and they started to, when they began to take back control, the white majority in southern states, they wanted to have laws which gave them back a legally favored position, even though slavery had been abolished. So US Supreme Court gutted the Equal Protection Clause, just like they gutted the other parts of the 14th Amendment, saying, oh yeah, separate but equal is okay. So you could have separate facilities for Blacks and whites, Black bathrooms, Black fountains, Black schools, and so long as it was equal. But of course, separate is never equal. And it did nothing, the Jim Crow laws did nothing but help keep Blacks impoverished and uneducated in the South on purpose, That's why there was a huge migration of Blacks from the South to northern cities like New York and Philadelphia and Chicago. There was a huge migration where things were relatively better, but still not perfect in America, which was still a very much racist place. And the Supreme Court had completely abdicated on enforcing equal protection under the laws against the states after Plessy versus Ferguson in 1892. It wasn't.
Sorry to interrupt you here, but so the libertarian viewer here would say, wait a minute, what is James telling us? Shouldn't be the rights, though immoral, shouldn't it be the right, let's say, of a restaurant to say we have different toilets or we don't admit anyone? So why do you say that this has to do with unequal treatment under the law when this has to do with, for example, how business do run their businesses?
Oh, no, Nikos. Under Jim Crow, you could not be equal in a private business. Equality was forbidden as a business owner. You had to treat Blacks and whites differently, Mr. Private Business Owner. You had to have separate facilities for Blacks and whites. A Jim Crow law required segregation by law. Black schools, white schools, Black bathrooms, white bathrooms, back of the bus for Blacks. So it's legally mandated racism against Blacks. It's not you as a private individual or as a private business can make your own decision. Had that been the case,
for the record.
Had that been the case, they would have been subject to free market pressures and racism would have been driven out in short order.
Okay, that makes sense, and it's important. The reason I'm going to bring back the libertarian take soon, because there is this myth, which is not entirely myth, that behind racism usually you find state policies, which is true historically. Although we're going to test later whether this undermines how rooted racism was in the psyche and in the mind, unfortunately, of many people. So we are now in the Jim Crow. In the Jim Crow law, so in the Jim Crow era. So what is the next big step when it comes to the development of law? Would you say it would be the Civil Rights Act? And what is happening in almost
No. A revolution occurs in 1954 when the Supreme Court overturns their 1892 decision, separate but equal decision, which upheld Jim Crow. By 1954, through the 1930s and 40s, there was growing criticism of Jim Crow laws and racism, mostly, I would add, among Republicans. Democrats relied on the South, which were solidly Democrat because of the Civil War, because of racism. The Democrats were the party that defended slavery, and the Democrats were the party that gave us Jim Crow when they took over control of the southern states. And so Democrats, until the early 1960s, were the party associated with Jim Crow. 1954, the United States Supreme Court strikes down separate but equal and says, no. In Kansas, the school board, you cannot have racially separate schools. Separate but equal ain't gonna cut it in education because it isn't equal. So the United States Supreme Court put strict scrutiny on any state laws that even recognized any racial difference. because it was insignificant. And by the way, the Supreme Court justice who wrote that was a Republican governor who from California, Earl Warren, who'd been appointed by a Republican president, Eisenhower. So it was the Supreme Court in 1954 who finally said Jim Crow is unconstitutional in theory. And that set off, more than anything else, the American civil rights movement. If it weren't for that, there couldn't be all these Rosa Parks test cases and all these other test cases. And the Supreme Court then began to say, no, you can't have this discrimination law, that discrimination law. And Southern governors began to protest. And Eisenhower, Republican president, sent out the National Guard to enforce the ability for Black kids to go to school against the will of Democrat state governments in the South.
For non-American viewers, the National Guard is something like a federal police.
Exactly. The President of the United States has the right to call out state militias in times of crisis. And here he said, go make sure that Blacks could attend schools in the South, even if Southern governors were opposing it. And there was a huge reaction in the South, a racist reaction in the South to all this. There's no doubt about that, but they were definitely on the losing side. And by the early 1960s, the Democratic Party switched positions. It began to embrace the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, especially under President Kennedy. And after Kennedy's assassination in 1963, there was the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now that went further than eliminating Jim Crow, that is to say, racially discriminatory laws in the South. It went further. That's the law that made private discrimination illegal. If you ran a public accommodation, a hotel, a restaurant, a business that was open to the public, you could not discriminate in who your customers were. And any employer could not discriminate on the basis of race in hiring. So there it was really the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which gave teeth to the idea that private discrimination was now illegal. They did not really give a chance for the free market to work racism out at all. They came down immediately saying private discrimination must also be illegal. I believe that was unnecessary and itself racist. You will notice that the 64 Civil Rights Act was not based on the Equal Protection Clause at all, because that would not provide any basis for doing this at all. It was the Interstate Commerce Clause that Congress said gave them the power to eliminate racism, even private racism in America. So
the impressive thing, people, is that James found out about this topic like 2 hours before the show. And
well, it's a topic I happen to be prepared on. Yeah, I know it was last minute, but I am doing it off the top of my head.
Imagine if he had prepared. So when it comes then so there are two things happening after the 60s. The one is the beginning of affirmative action, or you can correct when affirmative action is coming. And another thing, though, is discrimination continuing with means that are not overt. Let me give you an example. The Federal Housing Administration imposing the so-called redlining. Now, why is redlining super important? And we're going to spend some time discussing it. Because many of the critical race theorists or anti-racists today claim that the ghettos, the violence, the quote, black on black crime, all these things have their root in a racist policy. And this racist policy is redlining. Now, what is redlining? Redlining basically means that the government, to put it in very simple terms, and again, James can correct me, tells to the bank to guarantee mortgages only in particular areas. Now, in itself, this is not racist. You could say, because I only guarantee mortgages for rich people because I don't want to lose my money. But here's the catch. The areas where the government would guarantee mortgages were the dominantly white neighborhoods. And it gets even worse. And it gets even worse because in the areas where the government could not guarantee mortgages, what you'd have is loan sharks and people with very shady deals going to people who, some of whom couldn't even properly read, telling them, sign here. And what they would sign would say something like, if you don't pay me, if you delay your payment for a month, I'm taking back all your capital and the house. It's the contract here. So tell us a bit about redlining, and tell us a bit about this claim that says that this was basically a state-enforced racism from the back door in a way, but also whether you believe that it's a legitimate claim that it still plays a role today, because redlining became practically illegal in 1968. So someone
Yes.
could say, come on, it's been half a century. So
Yes.
what are we to make of redlining laws?
Well, first of all, it's kind of a package deal. If the redlining is truly done in a private way, that is to say, if an insurance company or if a mortgage company, because a neighborhood, and look at the state of American cities today with the violence and crime. In any event, if an insurance company or a mortgage company does not want to give a mortgage or an insurance on an inner city where the business might burn down or not work or just is not safe, then if they're making that on a private economic decision, I see nothing wrong with that. It is the community and its own safety that needs to correct itself, not the insurance company that needs to provide insurance on a charity basis. Now, on the other hand, see, I think it's kind of a package deal. On the other hand, insofar as governments were involved, and they were involved, since the 1920s, land use regulation, there were no land use regulations like zoning laws in America until the 1920s, when progressivism came along, of course. And progressivism gave us zoning laws. And of course, all those kind of economic regulations about land use, right? And even where highways are built and stuff could, through the back door, be racist. Labor unions, in many cases, early on, wanted their union to get protected, and that often had a racist effect. Oftentimes, constituencies would require governments to do things, and insofar it was the product of government regulation, as you point out, it's a totally corrupt thing. Now, government sources of redlining, as you point out, have been basically out since 1968. And so, insofar as redlining continues to exist, it is neither the result of intentional racism, because that would come down on them. That's a violation of federal law. Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would make that a crime. And so, yeah, that is pretty much out now. But what we're talking, and when we talk about critical race theory since the 1970s, which is basically when it was born, they realized that with the Civil Rights Acts and with the legal ending of things like redlining, that the issue wasn't intentional, attitudinal racism or overt racism in the law, right? But these perhaps non-intentional secondary effects. Did it still have a discriminatory impact, whatever people are thinking in their heads? Is America institutionalized? Does it still have institutions that promote racism, despite the change in attitudes? And between the 1950s and 60s, there was a tremendous change in American attitudes. Even in the South, there was a huge change in racial attitudes in America in the 1950s and 60s. No question about it. But redlining was in part the result of government regulation. Insofar as it was, of course, it's part like Jim Crow, it's government racism. But pretty much government racism or intentional racism has, in a negative way, been taken out of law.
So,
but I wouldn't confuse it with private redlining, which may be a purely economic decision.
Now, let's address this point on whether in a free market racism would be eliminated or be eliminated faster. Now, of course, it will be much, there's no even question that the worst aspect of racist politics, slavery, Jim Crow, had the hands of the states or all over it, the hands of the government all over it. However, if we take seriously the power of ideas, wouldn't we say that although respecting individual rights means that people should have the right to discriminate, wouldn't we at the same time say that racism would not be eliminated even if the government would completely get out of the economy, because it was so deeply in the minds and the hearts, or however you want to call it, of people? And I also need to say something here. As someone who I was not very familiar with American history, reading some stuff about racism, even in the 50s, are things that I couldn't believe. So in a way, I didn't know what I didn't know. I mean, we're talking about violations of individual rights, but even if they're not violations of individual rights, about behaviors that are unimaginable. So
racism continues in my country. It is still there. Look at the shooting in Buffalo, where a black neighborhood just a couple of weeks ago was shot up by some white militant. Racism is an ugly part of America, and it's always been there. It is in serious decline. It has a private attitude, but private attitudes cannot be reached by government regulation. But that's really a separate issue. The question is, who's going to stay in business? See, if I exclude irrationally some group, if I don't bake cakes for gay wedding couples, then someone else, my competitor, is, and he's going to get that business, and he's going to have a competitive advantage because he's rational about who he bakes cakes for. If I indulge any irrational prejudice, to that extent, I will suffer economically and be put out of business. So whatever the attitudinal positions of these business owners, if they would like to stay in business, they can't enact their racist bigotry, or they will suffer economic consequences. And history bears that out. Look at how blacks have penetrated in my country since the demise of Jim Crow laws. Some of the highest paid entertainers, some of the highest paid businessmen, billionaire entrepreneurs, Oprah Winfrey, the most influential person on American television today, is a black woman. It's interesting, it was during the time when we had a black president and a black attorney general for 2 terms, mind you, under Obama, that this notion of systemic institutionalized racism took over. No, our chief law enforcement officer and his assistant chief law enforcement officer are both African Americans. Oh, well, obviously America's systemic racist at that point. It just seems sort of bizarre in my view. So attitudes aren't the question. If you wanted to look at economic reality, they can't indulge their attitudes or they will suffer an economic price that they'll pay. Attitudes, what a free market does in economics is it encourages the rational. All other things being equal, the rational person, the non-irrationally prejudiced person, will have an advantage. So over time, racism will die out in a free market. It must. In fact, much more quickly than when you institute government policies. It is when in the 1960s that they gave us the welfare state, in the 1970s when they gave us affirmative action, that suddenly the brakes, huge progress was being made by African Americans, traversing from poverty and illiteracy into, in great numbers, rising tides were happening. That came to a screeching halt. So if we're going to talk systemically racist policies, that is to say policies which may not be intended as racist, but have a institutionally racist effect, why don't we start with a welfare system? The welfare system, in my view, does institutionalize a racially discriminatory effect on African Americans. That's what its effect was. And so if the left wants to look in a mirror, or how about their soft on crime policies that are going across America today? They ignore black on black crime. More black murders happen, of course, on the streets of Chicago and St. Louis and Baltimore, put together in the course of a year. That number dwarfs the number of even the terrible school shootings, and dwarfs by far police shooting of unarmed black people.
Yeah, there's not even a comparison.
Not even a comparison. So if we're talking systemic racism, I would point at the Democrats' policies. The left is hell-bent on keeping institutionalized policies that have a racist impact in effect. I would go so far as to say anytime they support drug laws, too. The drug laws have a disproportionately racist effect. I don't think that that's the motive any more than I think that was the motive behind welfare. Just the opposite. But the point is, if we have institutionalized systems that encourage racial disparities, in my view, the biggest ones come from the left.
Right. So we're going to tackle the most, let's say, difficult question last. But before that, let's see what the audience says. So big thank you to Marilyn, to Jonathan, and to Bonnie. So some comments. Marilyn says, outlawing private racism wasn't just unnecessary. It was an outrageous rights violation. It kept many from seeing the power of individual agency and what would happen to businesses that were racist. True. Then it contributed to the belief that the good requires government intervention, which has had far-reaching consequences. And the consequence, I would add, that today we consider it self-evident that the government can contribute, can intervene and coerce you. And the only question is, how are they going to do it? And unfortunately, the only defense by conservatives, particularly in Europe, is, quote, will it work? As if it works, the violation of one's rights, it's okay. And
but she's absolutely right. That is racism. It is racism to say that we need laws to end irrationalities like racism. And more than that, if you have a law against racial discrimination, it can often be the excuse to bringing a lawsuit when it had nothing to do with race. If someone, for example, loses a job for other completely independent, non-racial reasons, they can always still, oh, it was race. So it's totally racist itself.
And it's also non-objective law. It's like the hate speech law. How can you prove one way or the other?
Absolutely.
And one more comment. Thank you again, Marilyn. Government intervention leads to resentment and hatred that make racism worse. Yes, about resentment, and also I would say it also harms the self-esteem of the people it's supposed to help, because it's like, how did I get this job? Did I get this job because
I want to give a story there. I as a DA, I was a DA for 18 years, and one of the most competent African-American lawyers I ever knew, I won't name his name, he went on to become a judge. He's that good, but always over his head was, and he would say this to me privately when we'd go to lunch, was it, how did I get the job? How did I get the job as a judge? How did I get the job as a prosecutor? These aren't easy jobs to get. Was it because I was African American? Or was it because and I would be reassuring him, no, really, dude, I think you're a good lawyer. I think you deserve this. He needed psychological reassurance because of affirmative action. And here's a successful African American who's becoming a successful prosecutor and then a successful judge. And he's worrying about that. Or look at the other side of it. Asians have been systematically discriminated against by universities like Harvard. If you go by grades and SAT scores, they should be getting into Ivy League schools in America at much greater numbers. They have a pending lawsuit, right? They're a racial minority that has been legally discriminated against in my country. And yet they are being discriminated against on a purely racial basis to allow others in.
And you know what's the craziest thing? That's egalitarianism at its purest. I mentioned it in the Tribalist book. The administration knows that. So it's not that the administration says no Asian person is left behind, but they say, look, we have to support the more disadvantaged group. So that's the unimaginable thing that.
Think about it.
They know that
racism is okay to get rid of this institutionalized racism.
Yeah. And what about the individual Asian students that are left behind? No one cares about them.
Oh, wow. The individual. Oh, individual? Oh, lost in the shuffle. This is a particularly hardworking or competent Asian, Black, Jew. No. That's out the window. It's not a recognition of achievement or merit at all.
So let's go now, James, to the last question, which is also the most difficult one in terms of, or the anti-racist of today consider it like the checkmate. So they would say, look, James, you've been talking to us for half an hour about the racist roots of legislation and various pieces of legislation that held back African Americans. And you're talking about a period of centuries. Now, it's impossible not to admit that this has left traces today, even if these traces are the property and how much wealth a family would have compared to if it weren't for these racist policies. Therefore, they would say, somehow this injustice needs to be alleviated. Therefore, they would say things such as positive discrimination or reparations. And they would add, this is not something unique in America. We've had reparations, for example, for the states of Israel by Germany. We have the Soviets taking reparations by themselves after Second World War when they were looting basically Germany. So the idea that there's like collective, quote, punishment, or don't see it like punishment, collective bringing of justice to victims of past injustice or of injustice is not something which is unheard of. So why not reparations, or why not positive discrimination?
I'm all in favor of restitution to the victims. If the other examples you provided, if I can locate the people who were ripped off and stolen from the Nazi government, or even their children, reparations should be made. Those people are direct victims of theft and looting and murder. Yeah, but if we're talking about someone's great grandchildren, the funny thing is, I'm a white guy from America, right? I have ancestors who fought and gave their lives to free slaves in the Civil War. I have ancestors who, before the Civil War, owned slaves. Does the credit for one redound to me that they fought slavery? Or does the blame for the other that they owned slaves redound to me? It does not. Let's just back up here a little bit on this. There have been illiterate groups that came from dire poverty, that came to the top of the American economic ladder. I cite, for example, Asian Americans. Asian Americans economically outperform whites, people of European descent. The top income earning groups in America are no European groups, but in fact, Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, East Asian groups, Jews too, are the top income earning groups. They way outperform whites in America, way outperform. If racism were the cause of economic disparities, then Asians would not be doing so well. Now, mind you, some of these Asians have come from situations of literal slavery. Ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia were kept illiterate, very much like Southern slaves. They came from literal conditions of slavery in the 20th century, and they went in, boom, 1 or 2 generations to outperforming white Americans economically. So there are other factors behind economic disparities that have nothing to do with the racism of people around you or so-called institutionalized racism. The left, in looking at oppression from one perspective, one angle, there's one factor analysis of it. The situation with blacks is in part a cultural one. In fact, it's in part the situation with American black. If your grandfather immigrated from Kenya to America, you probably earn the national average. If your grandfather came from Alabama, you earn below the national average. Has nothing to do with racism. How could an employer know that your grandfather came from Kenya versus Alabama? Whereas African and Caribbean immigrants to America, even if they're African American, earn about the national average. Racism has nothing to do with economic disparities in America. I will repeat, economic disparities between the races has zero to do with racism. And so while we ignore other factors, for example, the left continuously telling them they're victims, the left continuously propagandizing collectivism and altruism into them, or the negative effects of the left's institutionalized racism, the welfare state, for example. All of that is contributing to the situation with black. Cultural reasons are contributing to this. Obviously, it is not race that is producing different economic disparate outcomes. Simply not the case. America is a systemically anti-racist place. Surely, since our federal laws have outlawed discrimination, we have a situation with America today. White academics will pretend to be black to get academic advancement. Blonde, blue-eyed senators like Elizabeth Warren will claim to have Native American ancestry when she has, less than 1% Native blood in her, which is lower than the American. I have a higher percentage of Native American ancestry than Elizabeth Warren, and she's claiming to be Native American. So if politicians and academics are claiming to be part of these oppressed minorities to get advancement, career advancement, let me suggest that America is far from being a racist place. It's an anti-racist place, systemically.
Right. So we've covered the basis of where critical race theory begins. We could have another episode discussing the rest of the arguments of critical race theory. But I think this episode works very well as an overview of law and race relations in the United States. So thank you very much. James. So this is, again, you hadn't prepared for this, and yet you came up with these things like that.
One last fact I want to throw in. The first black elected to the United States Senate since Reconstruction from the South is a Republican from South Carolina. Senator Scott. Republicans in the heart of the Confederacy, South Carolina, are willing to vote for blacks for statewide office. We do not have the problem that we did 50 years ago, much less 100 years ago. And unless we recognize that, Republicans from the South are willing to vote for Republican politicians. So long as the left keeps their head buried in the sand about the progress that America has made, the tremendous progress America has made, they are the racist ones. They are the ones encouraging victimhood so that they can keep the blacks on the political hook and use them as they've used them for most of my lifetime.
And the worst thing with these ideas is that racial thinking has become a trend again. Racial thinking has become acceptable, not only acceptable, but actually encouraged. But that's a different.
Yes, sir. Unfortunately, it's on the rise again. Yep.
It's on the rise, yeah. And it's even trendy. And okay, no upcoming shows tonight. So this was the dose of ARCUK that you get today. So thank you very much, James. Many thanks to those of you who watched.
Friday, we've got a great peek-off episode with the Nacers coming up. We're going to be talking about Ayn Rand herself. So if you're able to be there with us, bring your Atlas Shrugged questions. We're not Leonard Peikoff, but bring your Atlas Shrugged questions. We'll be talking about Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged, and the Peikoff podcast this Friday.
Sounds good. I'll be at my sister's wedding, but I'm going to catch up.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Well, not to me, but
well, to the family.
To the family. Yeah, it's a happy occasion. Okay. Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.